Imagine a royal child born into luxury, enveloped by the greatest power and wealth in Europe. Its destiny seemed set to rule a vast empire where the sun never set. Yet for the king we are about to speak of, his life was not a glittering crown, but a cruel curse, prolonging his every fragile breath. He couldn't speak clearly until he was 4 years old. He couldn't walk on his own until he was 8, an age when other children were already running around freely. His body was constantly weak, frequently ill, and in constant pain. When he died at the age of 39, his appearance was gaunt and emaciated, resembling an 80-year-old man on his deathbed. His hair had turned white, with only a few wisps remaining. He had no teeth left, unable to chew or speak clearly. His body had begun to decay from within, even before his soul left him so. What transformed a powerful king, an heir to one of the most illustrious dynasties, into such a pathetic figure? Was it a witch's curse or a divine punishment? No. The truth is even more horrific, and it lies within his own royal blood. The answer was not magic, but a genetic tragedy that spanned centuries: inbreeding. Today, we will uncover the horrific truth about Charles II of Spain, the most deformed king in history. He was not merely a victim of a powerful dynasty, but a living testament, the most painful legacy of an insane obsession. The obsession with preserving pure royal blood. To truly comprehend Charles II's tragedy, we must journey back in time to an era when one name resonated across Europe like thunder. Habsburg, the Habsburg dynasty, was more than just a name. It was an empire. For centuries, this was the most powerful royal family in the world, holding the thrones of the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and countless other vast territories. From Europe to the Americas, the sun seemingly never set. On their dominions, the Habsburgs' wealth, military might, and political influence were unparalleled. They were seen as symbols of eternity, of an empire destined to rule. But behind that dazzling grandeur and immense power lay an obsession, a philosophy that became a double-edged sword, eventually severing their own lifeblood. It was the obsession with pure blood, a deeply held belief that the dynasty's power and greatness could only be maintained if the royal blood was not tainted by inferior lineages. Marriage was not a matter of love or personal choice, but a political tool. It was a means to consolidate alliances, annex territories, and, most importantly, keep power concentrated within a single family. For this reason, intermarriage between close blood relatives became an unwritten rule, a tradition meticulously maintained through generations of the Habsburg line. Uncle marrying niece, cousins marrying each other, and even closer relations became a repeated pattern in the Habsburg family tree. They believed this would safeguard the sanctity of the throne, ensuring that the crown would always belong to the most worthy. Little did they know that the very thing they believed was their protection was planting the seeds of a horrific genetic catastrophe. Each inbred marriage was not just a thread in the family tree, but a link in a chain of tragedy waiting to erupt. And the climax of that tragedy would be most vividly expressed in the very form of Charles II, the most deformed king in history. The obsession with pure blood, with preserving absolute power within the family, plunged the Habsburg dynasty into a never-ending cycle. They believed that marrying outside their lineage would taint their noble blood. Thus, for nearly 2 centuries, intermarriage between close blood relatives became the primary strategy, a terrifyingly strict custom. Let's look at this tragic family tree. Charles II's father was King Philip IV of Spain. His mother was Mariana of Austria. Sounds normal, right? But the truth is far more twisted. Mariana of Austria was not only Philip IV's niece, but also his first cousin. This uncle-niece relationship laid the foundation for Charles's grim inheritance. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Philip IV's mother, Charles II's paternal grandmother, was also his paternal grandfather's first cousin. The degree of inbreeding continually compounded, forming a complex and horrifying web of relationships, where the bloodline circulated within an increasingly depleted and error-prone gene pool. In genetic science, there's an index called the coefficient of inbreeding phi. This index measures the probability that an individual receives two identical copies of a gene from the same ancestor. The higher the phi, the greater the risk of inheriting genetic diseases caused by recessive genes. For a normal person, the Fi is usually very low. But for Charles II, this index reached a horrifying level, 0.25.2. Put that into perspective. Children born from an incestuous relationship between full siblings typically have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. This means, genetically speaking, Charles II of Spain was almost equivalent to a child born from a brother-sister incestuous relationship, a terrifying taboo in almost every society. He was the result of 16 consecutive generations of inbreeding within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. With each generation, the royal bloodline became purer as they desired. But simultaneously, it became more fragile, more vulnerable, accumulating an increasing number of disease-carrying recessive genes. And Charles II, as the final point in this tragic chain, was a living testament to nature's grim punishment when genetic laws are bent by power and obsession. His tragedy was not random. It was a fate decided long before he was ever born. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, but from that very moment, his grim fate was sealed. He was not a healthy, plump prince like other children. On the contrary, Charles was so frail that he was baptized on his very first day, as fears mounted that he might not survive the night. His cries sounded like a pathetic whimper, foreshadowing a life filled with suffering as he grew. Charles II's physical form became the clearest reflection of his ancestors' genetic mistakes. He was a living testament to the price the Habsburg dynasty paid for their obsession with pure blood. His most prominent and arguably greatest tragedy was his legendary Habsburg jaw. Charles II's lower jaw protruded so severely that he could not close his mouth completely. His tongue was too large for his oral cavity, causing it to constantly hang out. This not only made it difficult for him to swallow, but also led to constant drooling, making him unhygienic and giving him an extremely odd appearance. Charles's upper and lower teeth did not align at all, making it impossible for him to chew food properly. Every meal became an ordeal, and he frequently vomited because he couldn't digest properly. His speech was also severely affected. With his oversized tongue and misaligned teeth, he stammered, mumbled, and was very difficult for others to understand. The king of a vast empire could not clearly articulate his will. Charles's health was a long saga of illness. He suffered from all manner of ailments from childhood, frequent fevers, convulsions, severe headaches. His skin was pale and sickly, and he started balding early. He had almost no eyebrows or eyelashes, making his face appear even more peculiar and lifeless. Mentally, Charles's development was also much slower than his peers. He was assessed as having mild intellectual disability, incapable of learning or concentrating like an ordinary person. This was a tremendous disgrace for a king expected to be wise and decisive. Charles II carried not only physical and mental deformities, he was also a fragile, vulnerable man. His body was constantly assaulted by illness, persistent pain, and a life of ceaseless scrutiny and judgment from those around him. He was a king, yet simultaneously a prisoner of his own bloodline. The truth about Charles II is not only medically horrifying, but also profoundly heartbreaking from a human perspective. He was an individual who endured continuous suffering, simply because he was the final product of a chain of historical errors. Charles II ascended to the throne of Spain at the tender age of 4. The same year his father, Philip IV, passed away. Even when he reached adulthood, he could not effectively rule the country on his own. His court was constantly dominated by regents and advisors, as the deformed king lacked the intellectual and physical capacity to fulfill the duties of a monarch. He was a symbol, a shadow on the throne, rather than a true leader. But the greatest tragedy in Charles's life was not that he couldn't rule. It lay in the immense pressure he had to bear, a burden every king faces, but for him, it became a cruel obsession. He had to produce an heir. The Spanish Habsburg lineage had stretched for centuries, but Charles II was the last of its direct bloodline. If he had no children, the dynasty would end. A vast empire would be left without a direct successor. It was an unimaginable weight placed on the shoulders of a frail, ailing man who was almost incapable of such a feat. Driven by this responsibility, Charles II married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a beautiful and lively French princess. Their marriage lasted for 10 years, but produced no children. It is said that Marie-Louise lived in extreme loneliness and despair within a foreign court with a husband she could not truly connect with. She died mysteriously at the age of 26. Many believed due to continuous pressure and sorrow. Undeterred, the court urged Charles to remarry. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a healthy and resolute German princess. Hopes were rekindled, but once again, tragedy repeated itself. The second marriage also yielded no heirs. Charles II, as a consequence of his inbreeding, was completely infertile. He could not perpetuate his lineage. He could not fulfill the most sacred duty of a king. Charles II's life was a long succession of physical pain, spiritual loneliness, and relentless courtly pressure. He was tormented by illness, imprisoned within his own deformed body, and ultimately haunted by his failure to produce an heir. Historians recount that in his final years, Charles II was but a shadow, his spirit completely broken, his body gradually disintegrating. He was not only the last king of the Spanish Habsburg line, but also the most painful symbol of the price paid for a misguided belief. When he finally passed away, the truth about his internal body was even more shocking than his outward deformities. It was the final devastating proof of the legacy of inbreeding. On November 1, 1700, Charles II, the deformed king of Spain, drew his last breath at the age of 39. His death was not merely the end of a life filled with suffering, but also the death knell for a magnificent dynasty, the Spanish Habsburg line. For nearly 2 centuries, they had strived to preserve their pure blood through inbred marriages. But that very obsession killed them from within, culminating in the weakness and infertility of Charles II. Before his burial, an autopsy was performed on Charles II's body. What the physicians found was even more horrifying than what could be imagined from his outward appearance. Historical records state that his body contained not a single drop of blood, but was instead filled with abnormal fluids. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, his lungs decayed and covered with ulcers. His intestines were putrid, and his head was filled with water. These findings revealed a chilling truth. Charles II was not only outwardly deformed, but his entire body had been severely ravaged by congenital deformities due to his genetic inheritance, making him truly a man rotting from within. The death of a king often leads to a peaceful succession. But with Charles II, the only legacy he left behind was a major political crisis. He had no direct heir, and the Spanish Habsburg dynasty came to an end. This event ignited one of Europe's largest conflicts in the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. European powers vied for control of the Spanish throne and its vast territories, completely redrawing the political map of the continent. Charles II was a victim, a man trapped in the genetic tragedy of his own family. His life serves as a brutal warning about the arrogance of power, about the blind faith in pure blood that drove a great dynasty to the brink of extinction. The story of Charles II is not merely a dark chapter in royal history, but a painful lesson about the cost of inbreeding. About how decisions from the past can shape a tragic destiny. Lingering through generations, the story of Charles II of Spain is not just a historical account of a king. It is a painful indictment of the cost of absolute power, of the blindness of a dynasty that sacrificed its own health, happiness, and even its very existence to preserve something it called pure blood. He was the ultimate outcome, the most vivid testament to centuries of inbred marriages. Charles II serves as a horrifying reminder that, sometimes, the greatest horrors do not come from war or plague, but from human decisions, from the manipulation of nature's most fundamental laws. His death not only ended a tragic life, but also heralded the end of a glorious empire that had self-destructed from within. Each generation of inbreeding was a cut, and Charles II was the final cut, severing the Habsburg bloodline in Spain completely. So were royal power, fame, and the purity of a bloodline truly worth exchanging for such a painful destiny and the eventual downfall of a dynasty itself? This question we leave for you to ponder. If you found this tragic and horrifying story of Charles II insightful, please don't hesitate to like this video. Feel free to comment below with your thoughts on Charles II's fate and the Habsburg dynasty's inbreeding tragedy. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on other mysterious, shocking, and emotionally resonant historical stories we'll bring to you in the future. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.